So my name is Cyle Cramer. I'm seeking the Democratic Farmer Labor Party endorsement to run for Congress in Minnesota's 8th Congressional District, ultimately to run against Pete Stauber. And I wanted to somewhat keep with the tradition of this group, offer kind of more educational style presentation. But at the same time, I wanted to introduce myself and my campaign, my background, and why I'm doing this. Ultimately, right now, what I think the party, the Democratic Party, is lacking behind is offering a true vision forward. We're not painting a vivid picture of our values, of our vision, and instead we're letting ourselves be defined by outside groups. And so a huge part of my running is being open about that message, about that vision, but also why that vision is important to me. And so that vision is important to me because programs that were championed by Democrats allowed me to thrive growing up. I grew up living with my grandparents as they aged and their health declined. We relied on things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, SNAP, free school lunches. And all of those things never made me dependent. Instead, they made me possible. They allowed me to fit in school. They allowed me to focus on school and not have to worry about where my next meal could come from. And so as a kid, I could dream big about my future. And
Hold the mic up
a little bit more, or is that too much?
All
right. Thank you. And so with all of that, I wanted to be able to serve my country back, to thank my country for what was done, and just be able to serve other people in a similar way. So when I was still in high school, 17 years old, I enlisted in the Army National Guard. Right after graduating, I shipped off and did 6 months active training and then served a 6-year enlistment. With that, I used the GI Bill to go to college and ultimately worked full time as I went to law school. And right out of law school, I wanted to find somewhere where I could continue to help people, continue to serve people. And I found a passion in representing individual unionized workers against billion-dollar corporations. And that experience launched me into a career kind of beyond anything I could have imagined at a young age. And that work and experience sets me off well to run for Congress, to know how our laws work, also to know how they're not working, and be able to fix those and just talk about them from this position of service, of caring for other people. A little bit more just demographic information about me. I grew up in the most southern part of the state, Faribault, Minnesota, town of 20,000 people. We ended up in the northern part of Minnesota because my wife wanted to practice rural medicine. She grew up in a town of 451 people, and so she practices as a family physician in a small town. And that's also why these rural communities, especially rural medicine, are really important to my platform as well. We have 2 young daughters. The photo here is a couple pictures of our oldest one, and then our youngest one is 7 months old. We're kept busy, but also they're incredibly motivating in wanting to change the direction of our country. I think that covers just kind of some basic details about me. My website is www.cyleforcongress.com. It is Cyle spelled with a C. I asked my mom why. She said I wanted to be different. That's where we'll leave it. And throughout this process, it's been great to come to communities like this. This is my second time in Ely, so I recognize a lot of the faces in here. So thanks again for showing up a second time. And I guess we'll move into the presentation. Maybe.
Give it one click. Now does it work? If you go backward and forward?
Yes. So another really important issue for me, and why that issue is important for me, is as a kid, I grew up as a Cub Scout and then a Boy Scout and spent a significant amount of time in the wilderness, camping and seeing our natural areas across Minnesota and primarily Wisconsin. And it became very apparent early on that an important topic in this district is our boundary waters and the kind of contentious topic about mining versus not mining. And as I looked into it more and more, my position became just more and more clear and direct because we have in this state and in this country a 150-year tradition of expanding protections for the boundary waters. And I'm going to just take some time to discuss specifically some of those expansions over time, what those protections did, what those protections meant, and where that brings us today. So the earliest initial protection that I could find was 1873. So when I say 150 years, I mean 150 years. So public domain lands in Minnesota were just withdrawn from general mining law of 1872. So in 1873, it became pretty apparent and clear that our public lands are special and they need to be removed from the general mining laws of the time. From there, in 1902, the United States General Land Office withdrew 500,000 acres in what would become the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness just from settlement. So now we're not only talking about mining, we're talking about settlement alone. So again, it's this history of expanding protections. A few years later, Christopher Andrews, the Minnesota Forestry Commissioner, persuaded the land office to withdraw an additional 659,700 acres from settlement. So now we're even talking about a bigger area. So again, a continued tradition and heritage of expanding protections. President Roosevelt established the Superior National Forest from public domain lands on February 13th, 1909. So again, more protections. And now we get into some of the reasoning for that. So I found some quotes from some of the key players here. So Arthur Carhart, a Forest Service recreation engineer who began the work to develop the area as a recreation resource. That was the goal. And Carhart wrote that the organization of the recreation resource in our national forests should not be on the basis of something that is delightful for the people of the country, but rather something that is indispensable. And that word indispensable really stood out to me, that nearly 120 years ago is what we had already decided as a country. So again, it's the whole theme of this presentation, expanding protections. 1926, the Superior Roadless Area was designed. So we go from mining to settlement to roads. And again, another quote kind of providing the background of this and really talking about why this is such an important thing. The purpose of this program is to conserve the value of the Superior National Forest as a game and fish country and as a national playground, offering a viral and wholesome form of recreation off the beaten paths. Not less than 1,000 square miles containing the best of the lakes and waterways will be kept as wilderness and recreation areas. And again, a thing that stands out in here is, talking about it's just not any land. It's not just any area. These are the best of the lakes and waterways, not only in the country, but really in the entire world. There's some fancy names of laws here. Again, less important about what those names actually are, but it's just this continued tradition and heritage of expanding protections. 1930, Congress passed the Shipstead-Newton-Nolan Act to prevent construction of water power plants within the Superior Wilderness. And the act stated the principle of conserving the natural beauty of shorelines for recreational use shall apply to all federal land which border on any boundary, lake, or stream contiguous to this area. So we're not only talking about a specific defined land now within a certain border drawn on a map, but we're talking about surrounding areas and how those surrounding areas do impact the areas within those borders drawn on maps. The expansion of the protected areas with the Thai Blackneck Act of 1948. I had a little joke on here on the bottom and then I removed it, but there was kind of a lot of clapping earlier, so I'll bring it back. I believe this is the same Blackneck of the Blackneck Bridge. If some of you are aware, the infrastructure bill that was passed under the Biden administration eventually included funding for the redevelopment of the Blackneck Bridge. Pete Stauber voted against that bill, but then once funding for it was happening in his district, he came out and took credit for that funding. So a little fun connection here with the name. But it directed the Secretary of Agriculture to acquire lands within the future Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness and established annual payments to host counties to support essential services like roads and public safety, helping stabilize local budgets. Again, expansion of protected areas, making those protected areas worthwhile, and finding ways to make those protected areas help our community. It's not like they were just set off to the side and forgotten about. They help the local communities here. And again, finding new ways to protect the area. In response to increasing airplane landing and low overflights that threaten the canoe country, President Harry S. Truman signed a 1949 executive order banning aircraft from flying below 4,000 feet over the area. And similar protective measures continued in the years that followed. So again, we're talking about lines written on a map, but also now we're talking about not only the areas around them, but the areas above them. More protections. 1964, President Johnson signed the Wilderness Act into law, creating the National Wilderness Preservation System, making a major milestone in the protection of America's public lands. So the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness was officially included among the original 9 million acres designated as wilderness. However, the law did allow certain activities in the Boundary Waters, such as motorized boating, some mining, and limited logging. However, those remaining issues were addressed by the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness Act, signed on October 21st, 1978 by Jimmy Carter. And that 1978 law also added 50,000 acres to the Boundary Waters, bringing the total protected area to over 1 million acres of land and water in the Superior National Forest. And so, again, I've been talking about this continued history and tradition, heritage of protection. I mean, you have Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President Truman, President Johnson, President Carter, spanning decades and decades of presidential administrations where the theme and the goal was clear and direct, protecting these unique lands. This is where I ran out of time to add pictures, so sorry. There's plenty of beautiful pictures online. But here's where we start to come into where all of a sudden this land becomes debatable. And it seems like prior to this. It was never a strong debate. It was clear where our protections and our heritage lie. But in 1966, the Bureau of Land Management issued 2 preference right mineral leases. Those leases cover nearly 5,000 acres just south of the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. So again, not within that drawn line, but it's very near to these protected areas. And at this time, in 1966, the government was really beginning to value land policy and favoring resource development, primarily because of the Cold War. There was concerns about a fractured world and needing to beat this race in the Cold War. And so that was kind of this initial culture shift happened around that time because of such a massive global issue, the Cold War. And so these leases provided legal access to the land. For the first time, there was a legal opening to do certain types of activity on this land, primarily mineral exploration with the potential of future mining if approved. So still mining was not permitted. In fact, it's never been permitted. So the mining was only for exploration potential, trying to see what's there, and any sort of future work would need to pass any sort of federal regulations. And so what seemed like routine mineral development policy in 1966 because of the Cold War became decades later the foundation for this national debate today over the legacy of these mineral rights and whether they should outweigh the protection of one of our most treasured wilderness areas. Despite some of that consideration of nearby mining, some of that exploration, protections continued to expand. So the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness Act reinforced protections. At that time, the Twin Metals lease area remained outside wilderness boundary, but within the watershed. And again, that's talking about this importance of lines painted on a map. Doesn't take into consideration every aspect of this. And mining was legally possible on the leased lands, but only with proper approvals. And so what is important here is that the Boundary Waters is not protected because of a fence or that line on a map. It's protected because of its interconnected lakes, rivers, and fragile freshwater ecosystems. And the proposed mine sits upstream from those water systems. The 1978 Act didn't say, you can't have any mining within X miles of the protected area, but it still elevated the protection of wilderness waters on a national level. And it created the debate of whether this type of mining, when we're talking about whether it be legally permissible, would have an impact on the protected areas. And so the debate at this time became, can upstream sulfide ore mining coexist with Congress's strengthened mandate to protect one of the most sensitive freshwater wilderness systems in the country? And for the fact that this debate started in 1978 and where we are today, I think we can agree that the answer is no. It's close to 50 years of this sort of system in place. And then over that time period, the same debate sort of existed, but there wasn't really an active interest or a consistent, strong interest in mining because corporations and different interests were selling these leases that were renewed multiple times over the period. So ownership transferred and then eventually became controlled by Twin Metals' predecessor. And so exploration rights continued, but mine construction still required environmental and federal approval, which still hadn't happened during that time. And so companies could study and evaluate the mineral deposits. And what we see during this time is the company paying for those rights to explore and then selling the company. Another company coming in, paying for those rights to explore, selling the company. And any actual mine construction during this time would have required federal approval from the Bureau of Land Management, consent from the U.S. Forest Service, and a full environmental rule under modern law, including Minnesota law and DNR protections. So while these leases persisted, development was never automatic. It remained contingent on environmental and federal authorization. Corporate interest bought and sold these lands as they thought they could make a profit, then realized that was likely not possible. And then eventually the foreign-owned Twin Metals just became another player in that decades-long game. So in 2016, the U.S. Department of the Interior declined to renew those leases. They saw this game that was being played. It was a waste of time, and those leases were not renewed. And the argument was a legal argument that the government could deny renewing those leases. If they had the authority to renew the leases, that would mean that they had the authority not to renew the leases. And at the same time, the Interior Department initiated a 2-year mineral withdrawal study to evaluate whether the surrounding areas of the federal lands should be withdrawn from new mineral leasing for up to 20 years. So this is really the first time that there was going to be in-depth research and investment put on researching what would happen if mines were put in these surrounding areas. And the decision emphasized the lease's proximity to the Boundary Waters Canoe area, wilderness, and the potential risks to the connected watershed, signaling that the location and hydrological concerns were central to the agency's determination. However, there was a big election later in 2016. And so in 2018, the United States Department of the Interior under the Trump administration reversed the decision, reinstated those mineral leases, restarting this 40-year game of selling, or not selling, but renewing these leases that were bouncing around to different companies. Administration officials framed this move. So they Donald Trump, he's a businessman. He knows how to sell things, knows how to make businesses go bankrupt too, but he sold things. The administration framed this move as part of the broader effort to promote energy dominance. That sounds really cool, energy dominance, and strengthen domestic mineral independence. Well, I don't know the energy dominance aspect of this. Not talking about power plants here. We're talking about mining. And the domestic mineral independence. Then Secretary Ryan Zink emphasized the importance of responsibly developing our domestic mineral resources and reducing reliance on foreign supply chains. There's two interesting things to point out there. Despite wanting to open up this area, he still has to hedge on the issue of protecting the areas. It's not just opening the area, but he's hedging and saying that we're going to do it responsibly. No explanation of how the past 40 years that hadn't been proven, just a talking point. And so that rhetoric suggested the issue was primarily about national security and domestic production. But that framing is incomplete and a lie in two key ways. First, the copper and nickel from the site were not reserved exclusive for government use. Not only was it not exclusively for US government use, it was known that the copper and nickel would immediately enter the global commodity markets like other minerals. The leases were held by a company ultimately owned by a foreign corporation, really complicating this foreign reliance narrative. Second, reinstating the leases did not equate to approving the mine. So there already was planned research in what sort of protections were necessary and whether this could be done. After this 40 years of leases being bought and sold. But now all of a sudden, they say they want to reopen the mines, but all of those types of previous protections were still in place. And so the administration's messaging implied that restoring those leases meant unlocking domestic production. But in reality, any mine would still require years of environmental review, federal permitting, and regulatory approval. And I've experienced this firsthand. I've talked to a couple people in here about how I think the judicial branch needs to be expanded, seen cases and trials get extended out for years and years. I really don't like the idea of years of environmental review, but when we're talking about such a unique area like this, that review needs to be done as thoroughly as possible. Also, sometimes that type of thing, years of review, ends up happening because of this buying and selling of these leases. One study gets started, it gets ended early, so another study needs to happen. And so it's not just some inefficient government regulation that's causing this. Instead, it's the players involved not wanting to follow through. But ultimately, the political message in 2018 to the American people emphasized immediate economic and national security gains. However, the legal reality was far more conditional and uncertain, and if anything, would make America weaker. And it also failed to consider how nearly 150 years of expanding protections rather than reducing them. In my mind, national security only matters if you have something to protect. So now that brings us to 2019, 2021. We have these leases back up and running again. Now proposals are submitted. Twin Metals submitted mine plans to the US Forest Service. Environmental impact statement process anticipated. But again, mining is not yet approved, pending review. And again, because this 2-year research study was stopped, the government is kind of left in a spot where they can't make the proper comparisons, do the necessary research possible, because once you finally had enough support to get it done, pendulum swung again, and that research disappeared. So what the government is even supposed to do with this information was difficult to understand and know. So Twin Metals submitted the formal mine plan, initiating this federal review process. Because the proposed mine would be located on federal land within the Superior National Forest, the project was expected to undergo a full environmental impact statement under the National Environmental Policy Act. And that law is a federal law that requires agencies to study, disclose, and consider environmental impacts before approving major projects, which kind of sounds like exactly what the Obama administration said needed to happen in 2016 before these leases were renewed. So it's kind of like dragging a carrot in front of the donkey, bringing these corporations along thinking that these protections were going to be opened up. Through the process, federal agencies would assess potential effects on water quality, wilderness character, wildlife, the interconnected watershed flowing into the Boundary Waters Canoe Wilderness. And again, at this stage, we're not quite to 150 years yet, but at this stage, no mining had been approved. Submission of the plan began the review process, and it did not authorize construction. Any development will remain contingent on environmental analysis, agency approval, and compliance with federal and state law. Then, 2020, another election happened. So the United States Department of the Interior under the Biden administration reversed the 2018 lease reinstatement, determined that the prior decision had been legally improper and that renewal was not mandatory under federal mineral leasing laws. And the Interior concluded that the government retained discretion over renewal and that the earlier reinstatement had not properly accounted for that authority. So again, you have the Obama and the Biden administration saying if the government has the authority to renew leases, we have the authority to decide not to renew those leases. The Trump administration's policy was the only option the government has is to renew leases. So it's not an option. It's just a mandatory. In 2023, the Department of the Interior went further and issued a 20-year mineral withdrawal covering approximately 225,000 acres of federal land within the watershed of the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. That withdrawal prohibits new federal mineral leasing in the designated area 2 decades. The Interior justified that withdrawal based on long-term concerns about the risk of sulfide ore mining in a unique area. And when we talk about long-term concerns, that wasn't rhetoric, that wasn't just an administration coming up with a talking point. At this point, we're nearing that 150-year mark. And as a result, the underlying leases were effectively terminated, and the federal mineral development may not proceed within the withdrawal during that 20-year period. Now, recently, Pete Stauber enacted 2 different resolutions, Resolution 140 and House Resolution 490. So if enacted fully, this resolution would nullify the public land order, removing that mineral withdrawal and removing that protection from 225,000 acres of the Superior National Forest watershed of the Boundary Waters. And also because these resolutions say that the rule shall have no effect, the withdrawal just completely disappears as though it had no effect. And what that means is the land would no longer be withdrawn from mineral leasing. The Bureau of Land Management could again consider new mineral lease applications in that area. And it does not include, though, the automatic reinstatement of those previously canceled leases. It does not include an approved mine. It does not eliminate this environmental review, which again had been a game played by these companies for decades and decades. It just puts us right back to where we were a decade ago. And so, in conclusion, for over 150 years, America expanded protections of the boundary waters. Leasing for exploration was only originally triggered during the Cold War and those fears at that time. Current legislation is not only about opening uplands for mining, but targeted at expedited removal, rollback of regulations, all bolstered by a national security framing, despite no domestic ownership or mineral retention safeguards. So I guess I don't know what the time is, 12:42. there's more time, I'll take questions. I love questions. Doesn't have to specifically be about this. Again, I'm a candidate seeking a DFL endorsement. So I'm open to taking questions about any sort of policy position. I won't shut off the mic and run out the door if you ask a question I don't like. Okay.
My voice carries.
The outdoor voice.
It sure does.
Kyle, if you are elected, will you sign on as a co-sponsor and support Betty McCollum's bill to withdraw the entire Boundary Waters watershed property?
Yes, absolutely. And that was already laid out on my website. One of the really important things to me about campaigning is trying to be as direct as possible on these issues, explaining them out. And so on my website, cyleforcongress.com, there's a list of platforms. I know sometimes they're a bit lengthy, that's just who I am. But I do say that I would sign on to that bill.
Okay. If you could just shout it, I'm gonna capture it.
I appreciate this presentation, and this is an important piece. There's Cox Richardson has a piece on the internet that is very supportive. Again, I'd like to go just a little different direction. Minnesota typically has been a sanctuary state. Do you support that? And I'm talking about people of color, I'm talking about people's gender issues, etc.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. I grew up in a community where the kids around me came from very different backgrounds, different parts of the world, and it was very eye-opening to see these families wanting to come here, work hard, and provide for their families. And I never had a problem for that. In fact, seeing that as a kid was one of the things, I think more than anything else, that made me proud to be in. Totally.
Wondering about like, what's your position on like, say, Title IX, gender reform and the current administration? You know, basically the policy that is, you know, on gender. You know, there is nothing else.
Yeah, and you know, it's such a broad topic that covers so many different kind of areas. Because like Title IX and sports is different than bathroom considerations, all of that sort of thing. And I mean, one, like, I don't really care where people pee, and I have two young girls, and my oldest is very independent. I know pretty soon she's gonna want to go use the bathroom by herself. And I can already hear coming from the women's bathroom, "Daddy, I need help." And I, don't want that to be against the law for me to have to try and go and help her. It's just the type of law and policies, it just doesn't make sense. I mean, like, just kind of leave people alone. And how do you enforce it? Are people supposed to bring birth certificates just to use a public restroom? It just seems like such a non sort of issue with me. The sports issue is a little bit more technical, complicated, and ultimately these high school leagues, college leagues are all operated by non-government organizations, and these non-government organizations are specifically designed to make these decisions with the health and safety of kids in mind. And those systems have built in appeal processes and reviews to make sure on an individual basis, that there were considerations for competitiveness, safety, in those. And so I always think that any type of individual assessment, the massive group judgment is gonna be important. So that I would prefer that those types of individual assessments from those individual organizations will be allowed to persist.
Okay. Let's say that the Democrats take over the House, which they must, and, but not the Senate. What can the House do to curb Trump in the last 2 years of his administration?
Yeah, so twofold. A lot of his actions are executive orders based on interpretations of enforcement of law. And so we can rewrite those laws, change those laws, essentially nullify those executive orders. And a lot of the damage that's happening right now is based on where funding is going. And we've seen polling funding from ICE based on certain restrictions. And so it's about navigating that funding. Another big concern I have is the rampant fraud and corruption that's happening in the White House, investigating that and really defining the harm that's happening to this country. Again, Trump is a marketing guy. He knows how to spread a message. On its face, it kind of seems nice that all these corporations want to step in and fund this east wing of the White House. That seems great. It's not our tax dollars. But we're still consumers to those corporations. And in order for those corporations to hand over hundreds of millions of dollars, our prices are going up. And I want to know in the background what sort of deals are being negotiated because of that hundreds of millions of dollars. And so that's the other thing that Congress can do, use its subpoena power and investigate these issues.
Right. Kyle, thank you for being here. I was at your first meeting pretty deeply too. And what I find is the most refreshing thing is we have a candidate who steps up and speaks eloquently about the things that you believe in, instead of tiptoeing around like some of our politicians tend to do, even when they're trying to get elected. You are straightforward about all of these things, and I really appreciate that. I wanted a couple of points I wanted to make. What concerns me deeply too about Stauber's fight to open up all of this stuff is this march to remove any public input in the whole permitting process, that's enormous. That's how it all came to be shut down with this 20-year, take a pause. And so that really concerns me, this march to just cut out the public opinion, we constituents who are putting these people in office. Also, last time you talked about your deep care and concern for healthcare issues in this country, and that's a broad spectrum. But you spoke to that point too. I just like to hear any updates or any other opinions of yours on healthcare issue, insurance, Medicaid, Medicare.
Yeah, and so healthcare, especially rural healthcare, is really important to my platform. And I try to be, again, direct on an issue, look at the best way that we can solve it, especially in a bipartisan way, because this is something that we need today. Right now, there's an existing law that helps fund rural hospitals, rural clinics. That was passed in 1997, and it placed certain types of restrictions on those hospitals based on populations, medical evidence at that time. But now our populations are changed, our communities are different, and medicine has changed. And so I just want to go in, update this law so more hospitals and more clinics can get those grants that are needed to build in communities. And just healthcare funding is incredibly important. I think we need a single payer system, because right now we're seeing health insurance companies make more and more and more in profits. And instead of using those profits to reduce costs, they're just increasing costs. And it's not really working for the American people.
Right.
I think I'm just an armchair observer, I guess, it seems to me that we can be pretty competitive here. You're from the southern part of the district. It's a redder part of the district. Seems to me that in order to win this seat, we need to do much better in that part of the district than we've done in recent cycles. How are you going to do that?
Yeah, and the interesting thing is the party itself is already recognizing that. So with the endorsement process on February 3rd, there were the caucuses. Who made their caucus on February 3rd? Awesome. It seems like a majority of the room. Delegates at those caucuses will go on to their individual unit conventions over the next couple of months. And at those unit conventions, some delegates will move on to the congressional convention. This congressional convention is where the candidate for Congressional District 8 would get endorsed with a majority of the delegates. And usually that's in Duluth, maybe Grand Rapids. But this year it's going to be in Chisago City. It's going to be at the local high school down there. And I think that's going to draw a lot of attention to that community that normally doesn't see that DFL involvement down there. That'll be a big deal and a great launching point. And then, you know, as much as these long drives up here are a lot of fun and these communities are great. With me living in Chisago City, it'll be much easier than, you know, the traditional kind of Duluth candidate to reach out to that area down there and really connect with the rural needs and the farming needs that are more part of that district than the farther northern part of the district.
I wonder, with your background as a lawyer working in the sort of subsector that you do, what are some more general things you might say about how our country's culture of accepting like corporate personhood and deference to big corporations, like how is that impacting us negatively, and how does that inform your politics?
Yeah, and so what I've seen with increased corporate power is it dehumanizes the workers instead of being about benefiting the people that are working a career, trying to make a living for their family. It's about the bottom dollar. It's about the shareholders. And what we need is more unionization, stronger workers' rights. And I've seen it firsthand where in cases where we're alleging retaliation, a person was fired for whatever reason, when they're unionized, often before they can get not even to trial, but a trial date, their union has returned them back to work with back pay. And that type of humanness to it, you know, having your local union rep being able to connect you on a higher level, get you the rights and get you your job back, has just been incredible to see firsthand. And I want to be able to expand that type of human connection when it comes to people's careers and livelihoods. Got one back here.
All right, be loud. Okay, I guess I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the federal level in regards to education. Often it's kind of left to the states and local levels, but seems to be something that times like this is often a controlling aspect of society.
Yeah.
Federal action or any actions at any level.
Yeah. And so I spoke about it at the beginning, but I grew up with a strong public education and opportunities that I had through that strong public education, access to music programs, some traveling with those music programs, really opened up something that I never really would have seen before. I mean, my first trips out of the state really were with my school. And so funding our schools is absolutely important to me. It is a major priority. And I think local funding is starting to reach its limits. We need to be able to find better ways to fund our schools and just to have our schools benefit local communities, have programs that are strong for those community needs, but also the federal government recognizes more and more that we are a global economy, we're a global, player in the economy. So our schools also need to focus on that global competition. And so, I mean, just federal funding in general and some federal involvement in that competitiveness is going to be important. Yeah, I want to make one final plug. So the most important thing this campaign is getting out, communicating people, reaching people. And in this district, it's especially hard. This is the 13th largest district in the entire country. When you consider Alaska as a district itself, that makes us pretty unique. And coming out, doing these face-to-face things are really important. But really to be able to reach the amount of people that we need to in this district is going to require a lot of phone banking, a lot of calling, and even just to lay that platform, there's a cost to get access to phone numbers, to supporters, people that have supported past campaigns. So I ask that you donate to the campaign. You can do that on my website, kyleforcongress.com, again with a C. Thanks, Mom. Or it's pretty simple, a check to P.O. Box 444, Chisago City, Minnesota 55013. Thanks.